have to heat this up because the coffee was still on, but it was not warming up. Okay, do you want me to plug in, Johnny?
Yeah, I think you can plug in.
Well, yeah, but that push thing,
It's over.
it's on?
Yeah. Okay, I thought I'd lead off with just kind of an oddball recommendation. This is a documentary film. It's really an art film from 1929, so it's silent, experimental, kind of slice of life, social life, where in Soviet Russian Ukraine. So it's street shots in Kiev and Odessa and Kharkiv mixed in with evidence of industrialization and a slice of everyday social life in these places. It's fascinating. So if you're interested, I could send this to you rather than you copying it down. Okay. So now I want to start with Fareed's latest opus. He is very much concerned about a new Republican initiative. And the Republicans are criticizing Biden for being too soft on China. And Fareed thinks that their approach is really dangerous, really dangerous. We've seen this guy before. This is nothing new, Gallagher. And he's the chairman of the Joint Congressional Committee on China. He's been on our radar, but he's just come out with a new article in Foreign Affairs, really calling on America to conquer the trade war with China, not just manage the relationships. And we had some success here at Woodside with the Biden and Xi Jinping. And the committee has praised Biden for strengthening U.S. alliances and restricting Chinese access to our computer technology in particular. And the Congress has gotten together and endorsed a competitive mode to compete with China. But now the Republicans are blaming Biden for squandering those early gains by prioritizing a short-term thaw. And they think that China is evil in the sense of how they're managing their country. And that we should be going for long-term victory and not just managing competition. So you remember this guy from before. He sees us in a struggle, existential struggle with China, and he's accused the Democrats of whitewashing Chinese aggression, that we're on the path to surrender or submission. And he has put pressure on American businesses, specifically Apple, that's doing business in China, Disney, for appeasing Beijing censors, and Nike for making tennis shoes, sports shoes in China. And so, but he's retiring. And some Democrats might be breathing a sigh of relief, but he's retiring just because he's disgusted with his fellow Republicans. And so who knows who's going to take his place as chairman. He co-wrote this article with Matt Pottinger, who is Trump's senior most aide on China. And Fareed summarizes this new essay. And he says they're advocating a containment policy. And they are wanting to go even further by we should encourage the Chinese people to rebel and explore new models. And even Pottinger's talked about regime collapse. So Fareed Zakaria is quite alarmed by this new kind of rhetoric. And it's not that Democrats take it all that serious, but the Chinese do. All of a sudden, that changes the rules of our interaction with them. If we have some Americans calling for regime collapse, and they want Biden to be like Reagan and push the Soviet Union like he did. And so Fareed is actually grateful for this essay because now they've put their cards on the table and they're quite explicitly calling for regime change, not just secretly. And he thinks it's reckless, dangerous, and utterly impractical. He points out correctly that China is nothing like the Soviet Union was. Soviet Union was an unnatural empire cobbled together from the remnants and spoils of World War II. China, on the other hand, is an ancient civilization. Soviet Union didn't trade at all. China is the largest trading nation now, even more than we are. And that of its exports, 92% are private. I know there's a lot made about the public sector in China, but he points out 92% of exports come from private firms. And we've talked about how China has problems, but they're still growing at around 5% a year, and they're likely to stay the second most prominent economy for decades to come. The Soviet Union was isolated from international trade, but China's deeply integrated, accounts for 20% of the world's GDP, as we've said before, versus Russia. Russia, and it still is, just sort of a Siberian Saudi Arabia. And so when oil prices collapsed in the 1980s, so did the Soviet Union. But nothing that drastic economically is going to happen to China because they're diversified. And we're going to have a hard time getting allies for this because they're the largest trade partners, over 120 countries, even more than we are. And all those countries want to maintain good ties, even Europeans. And this came out really strongly when Macron did not defend America's alarm about Taiwan and Chinese aggression. He said that's more American business, and he's reassured Xi Jinping in Beijing that was not Europe's priority. Well, we went crazy when he did this, but Fareed says that a wide range of Europeans have told me confidentially that privately they believed what Macron said publicly. So this just wasn't, Macron just wasn't an outlier. So, and what's the chance that we're going to get the Chinese people to rebel against the government? Their incomes have gone up ninefold since the reform of Deng Xiaoping. So good luck with getting the Chinese people in on this. And frankly, this is going to, I think, cause the Chinese people to rally in defense and even strengthen the hands of the nationalists in China. So Fareed invites us to think about the success of regime change. And we really haven't had much success. Here's all the countries where we've tried and we've failed. Most spectacularly with Iraq, which we've talked over and over again, has probably changed the course of American influence in the world. But this side effect of trying something like this might even cause an unraveling of the global economy. And increase the odds of a world war. And Fareed recommends sober reflection. Yes, Jim.
Do you have a list of successful regime changes? I can think of one.
Okay.
Puerto Rico.
Oh, your aunt.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, just remind us of that.
Well, we invaded Puerto Rico, and to this day, it's become Americanized. My aunt was in jail for her independence affiliation, but that's another story for another.
And, some people say we've been pretty successful with the Kurds and managed to isolate them away from Iraq. So, all right. So I just have finished that. I want to get back to international law. A quick review of what we said last week. We remember that Persia, with the liberation of the Jews from Babylonia, was said to have set a model for one country getting involved in the oppression of another ethnic group. And we recall that when the UN set up its International Human Rights Charter, Iran had presented an antiquity from Cyrus the Great to the UN. We talked about that last week. And then in that spirit came the first Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all that flowed from that. But it was mostly aspirational in that it defined what the ends were, but it didn't provide in 1948 any means for achieving them. And we reviewed the history that there's always been a legal barrier in the sense that there was an understanding of non-interference in a neighbor's business since 1648. And that sovereignty reigned supreme. There was no appetite for joining with one nation, an intervention in another one. But right away, this guy came up with, hey, but there's got to be an exception for genocide. And he actually coined the term. We talked about his history. He was influenced by the Armenians, but experienced at the hands of the Turks, but mostly he was Polish Jew, and he lost 49 relatives in the Holocaust, came to America and got the Genocide Convention passed internationally, but the United States didn't ratify it for a long time. They were as the world's policemen. They were worried about being charged with in their interventions around the world. They did not want to fall under international law. But eventually the objections of the American Bar Association, who was concerned about U.S. sovereignty, finally led to the Senate ratifying it, and it left the door open then for Clinton getting involved in Somalia. That didn't turn out so well, but eventually in Syria, and ultimately over Kosovo in 1999. And this was really the moment that we escaped under the constraints of the spirit of Westphalia. And of course, the one person that objected the most was Putin, because we were, after all, attacking a Slavic country that was threatening an Albanian country. And you'll remember this quaint conclusion of an international commission that was illegal, but nonetheless legitimate. It was the only way to stop the killing. And then there's started talk of just wars, and then there was talk about, hey, we can't rely on the Security Council because they're paralyzed by vetoes. And that was kind of Bush's thinking when he went into Iraq, that he was stopping a genocide. And if you look at what happened to the Kurds in the 80s and 90s, there's some justification of that. This was an important book. Samantha Power came out in 2002, just going through all the mass atrocities, the history of mass atrocities. And then finally, the International Criminal Court came into being in 2002 in sequence with the former events. And it provided for prosecution of individuals for genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. And it was a major innovation, a major step forward in the thinking of an international law. But the global South countries thought it was too Eurocentric and even racist. So sometimes this is referred to as the Rome Statutes, because that's where the convention was passed. And a court was opened in The Hague. We looked at this map last week. And we spent some time looking at who signed and who hasn't signed. We spent some time on this one, and it's become clear to me that included in this green swatch just outside of Israel is the West Bank. And so all of a sudden, the International Criminal Court feels like it has jurisdiction because the people of the Palestinians on the West Bank signed it. Israel hasn't, but they have. And so you'll remember that South Africa has bought a case against Israel in the International Court of Justice, which is a little bit different. I'll get to that in a second. But also, their chief prosecutor has been touring Gaza and looking for victims of Hamas. So they're being even-handed. They're investigating Hamas for the International Criminal Court, but they're also looking at Palestinian victims that are coming as a result of the Israeli invasion of Gaza. So this British barrister named Karim Khan is investigating both sides. And all of a sudden, this is from an article in this week's Economist. Netanyahu's getting disoriented. And you can tell that he is scared because he set out a video condemning preemptively an outrage of historic proportions should he be accused of the International Criminal Court of committing war crimes. So he's making strident public comments suggesting that hey, this is really getting close to him personally. Israel has not signed the Rome statutes establishing the International Criminal Court. But as I said, the Palestinians have. And so any actions carried out in Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank fall under its jurisdiction. You know, we think of it, well, it's occupied by Israel, but under international law, it is an entity that's being ruled by an outside nation. But it still has a legal standing, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank for the Palestinians that are there. And the Palestinians formally ratified it and joined the treaty. America hasn't signed the statute, the Rome document, but it's cooperating closely. Why? Because the International Criminal Court has indicted Putin. And so all of a sudden we see the advantages of the International Criminal Court, even though we haven't signed it, again, out of concern as the world's policemen, we are more exposed to charges like that. Aiko.
Can they go back and say prosecute Bush for his actions in Iraq?
I don't think so. I don't think it's retroactive because I don't think so. I haven't heard any talk about that. But you know that in the past we had Pinochet. Right? That's probably what you're thinking of. Pinochet was prosecuted in Spain, of all places. Yeah, good question. I don't know. We'll find out. But here's what The Economist says, quote, Netanyahu's terrified that he may join Mr. Putin in receiving an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court. Now, my Palestinian friends are very skeptical that of these international laws and how much their impact they're going to have. But according to The Economist and the BBC, Netanyahu is worried about it, in spite of his words that it would be like pouring jet fuel on the fires of anti-Semitism. He still is concerned about it. And in particular, they're liable specifically for obstructing the food supplies that the United States has been trying to send. That could very well be the lead indictment, the victimization of civilians in Gaza. And it wouldn't be just Netanyahu, it would be the defense minister and some of the major generals responsible for blocking the food supplies. And so, again, going on with the Economist article, it looks like he appears to have less control over current events, and he has reversed himself and is letting the supplies of food go into Gaza. He's delayed the planned attack on Rafah. Whether that'll continue as we speak is unknown. And he has been more amenable to at least discussing a truce with Hamas. The details of that are devilish for sure. But there's evidence that he's being guided by the threats and our blandishments of particularly of Americans, and even some generals, Israeli generals, are grumbling that he's given us Americans a veto over what they're going to do. This is verified by the BBC. This just isn't the Economist going rogue. There may be other reports that I'm unaware of. So just to review the history of previous arrest warrants, we've already discussed Putin, who couldn't travel to Armenia or South Africa because of the indictment. Gaddafi had been indicted, as had a Ugandan warlord. We all remember Milosevic, but it wasn't under the International Criminal Court. It was a predecessor, a special International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. In any case, no Western-style Democrat has been indicted, and Netanyahu would be the first, and it would be quite a stigma. So he's between a rock and a hard place. He's only hanging on to power because he's put together a coalition of that includes ultra-nationalists who threatened to leave if he softens his stance in Gaza, and that would bring down his government, and even the more pragmatic wing of his own party, a member of the war cabinet, meets with Blinken independently of Netanyahu, and his side of the spectrum could withdraw from the government. So Netanyahu's really sweating it. Now, the International Criminal Court's not to be confused with the International Court of Justice. And this hears disputes between states, not individual criminal indictments. And South Africa has, as a state, has gone to The Hague and invoked the Genocide Convention there. And Israel has signed that one for obvious reasons. And the court said it didn't tell Israel to stop its military operations, but it did say that you have been remiss in your humanitarian aid. And they said it's plausible that you have been breaching the Genocide Convention. Israel says that it has adjusted and is complying, but of course, many dispute that. There have been some complaints that because the Court of Justice has no jurisdiction over war crimes, that it encourages nations to jack up the level of their complaints to the level of genocide, which of course cheapens the taboo against genocide. The other thing is China, usually a foe of international courts interfering with sovereignty, is being quite opportunistic and is supporting the claims, the South African claims of genocide. Enforcement is another thing. So again, the court stopped short of telling it to stop its military offensive, but admonished it regarding the side effects and civilian suffering. Maybe they're unscathed, but there's been a stigma attached to them. They've lost they may have won the battle, but they've lost the war, and they're now more vulnerable to international law, at least psychologically. I wanted to pause at this moment where we're looking at Israel's difficulty and look at a big what if. And it really comes from this book, Power, Faith, and Fantasy. I've mentioned it a number of times. But I had a discussion this last week with a friend who was making sympathetic statements about Israel and that they had no choice. And it just reminded me of this book that is quite comprehensive, going back to the Barbary pirates and Thomas Jefferson. But our involvement in Israel has been going on for 2 centuries. But just going back 1 century, there was a whole chapter that looked at the 1920s and a binational movement in Palestine. And there were enlightened idealists back then. And I'm going to focus in on one in particular, Judah Leon Magnes. So we've always looked for local angles, and we have a very local angle with Judah Leon Magnes, as you will see. Just to cut to the chase, in 1948, he predicted that even if a Jewish state is established, and that was the question of the day, would the Jews get an actual state, or would they just get a homeland, a vague homeland? That if a Jewish state was established, and even if they defeated an expected response from the Arabs in war, it would experience a never-ending series of war with the Arabs. Now, this was an idealist speaking, and he's been dismissed as an idealist, but sometimes an idealist comes up with a realist conclusion, because that's what we're facing here. He had risen and had been the dean, I think the president of Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He was born in the Bay Area, but I'm going to tell you how he got to be the president of Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And in that capacity, he had asked George Marshall. He was so alarmed that he wanted the United States to impose sanctions on both sides. Well, you'll remember when we talked about Truman and his ultimate decision to back the Israeli state, influenced by his personal friendship with Eddie Jacobson, that Marshall had confronted Truman at the time with this sentiment that it was going to be an unstable situation to actually grant Israel statehood. So, but I want to spend a moment, because this guy's local, looking at what the idealists were responding to. King Faisal, who was played by Alec Guinness in Lawrence of Arabia, considered the Jews as Semitic cousins and welcomed them, and even welcomed the avowed Zionists. Now, the definition of Zionism has changed over time, and it's disputed even today. So it's a fraught term, imprecise, but there was some measure of optimism. We talk about the Abraham Accords. Well, here the Semites were all sons of Abraham, and here was another. Magnes was not alone. This was an American-born Zionist leader. She was the founder of Hadassah, and she co-founded with Magnes a political party that was dedicated to a binational solution. And that's what Judah Leon Magnes, the main character for the rest of today, wanted to do after his experience. So what was his experience? He was born in San Francisco in 1877. He'd been a pacifist in World War I. And he had been very much involved in American Reform Judaism. He was the first chancellor at the Hebrew University, and as I said, later became its president. So he eventually moved to Israel, but we pass his museum all the time on Alston Way. This is the Berkeley Film Archive, Art Museum. This is the university here. This is Oxford. And his collection's there. When we were, Iko and I first met in the 60s, his museum was on Russell Street. But over time, that became an insufficient space. So it's moved into the heart of Berkeley now, his collection of Jewish art and life. And they have an active program. I'll get back to that. So before he went to Israel, he went into the reform, Jewish reform movement, but he thought that they'd maybe become too reformist. So he favored a more traditional approach to Judaism, just taking a step back from over assimilation. And it wasn't satisfying to some of the younger Jews. They were seeking a more spirituality, which they found in other religions, and he thought that that was because the Reformed Judaism had gone too far. And he also saw that with the Eastern European immigration to America, there was all of a sudden a religious division. The first wave of Jews who had become assimilated and were mostly German had tended to be reformed, while the new immigrants from Eastern Europe were still devoutly traditional. And so he studied this and wrote a book and recommended unity, that we have a common history and we have common hopes. So born in San Francisco, moved to Oakland, and he was influenced by the first Jewish woman, rabbi. His bar mitzvah was printed by the Oakland Tribune, so it must have been something. And then he studied, this is from a personal point of view, this is interesting to me. He studied at the University of Cincinnati, where my mother graduated. Now, she graduated in the late 30s, so a little bit after he was there. But why Cincinnati? Cincinnati was the center of Reform Judaism. Go figure. But that's the way Judaism evolved in this country. It wasn't New York City. It was Cincinnati. And all that had to do with the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe had set up a theological seminary in Cincinnati. And she wrote, of course, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is centered right across the river in Kentucky. That's where Uncle Tom's cabin was. So already there was Protestant religious theologians there. It was a hotbed of theology. And so he went to Cincinnati, graduated. As I said, he had found the Spanish-American War to have been an unrighteous war, and that prepared him to be a pacifist in World War I. He was had an interesting response to the assassination of McKinley, who he considered a dishonest man. And he was a real lefty in those days, sympathizing with Eugene Debs, a Hoosier, by the way, and Norman Thomas, who opposed World War I. So he had visited Ottoman Palestine in 1907, and Reform Judaism in those days were very much anti-Zionist. And he very much disapproved of any nationalistic ambitions that the Zionists may have had. But he roughed it. He went native, traveled by horseback, camped, grew a beard, met Jewish colonialists who weren't necessarily Zionists. And he was skeptical of this new Jewish proposed town called Tel Aviv. Nevertheless, he went to the Zionist conference just to see what was going on. And he had been so moved by his visit in 1907 that in 1922, so he's in his late 40s, he immigrates to Palestine. And he thought that to have a very active Jewish community in Palestine, even though at that point it was a British mandate, would enhance Jewish life within the diaspora, to have Jews back in the homeland. He was not a Zionist, though. And he said, listen, if you're going to build a land of Israel, a homeland, which the Balfour document provided for, not a state, they should build a land in a decent manner or not build it at all. And by that, he meant to treat the Arabs fairly. So again, founded the Hebrew University and worked with Einstein and then Chaim Weizmann. We talked about Weizmann when we were talking about Truman. But they didn't get along. And when Magnes was given some responsibility, institutional responsibility, Einstein resigned, calling him a failed American rabbi, a dilettante who is escaping his family in America, and really dissed him as an ambitious and weak person who assembles morally inferior men. Wow, there's a story there. Why? What was his spat with Albert Einstein? Not the greatest person to pick a fight with. But he found the Hebrew University would be an ideal place for Jewish and Arab cooperation, and he worked tirelessly to advance that goal in spite of the 1929 Arab revolt. And he stuck to his guns. We still need a binational solution to Palestine. I'll get to the details of what he was thinking in just a second. And so he dedicated the rest of his life to the reconciliation with local Arabs. And the rest of his life, unfortunately, his life ended in 1948 at the end, after Israel had become a state, which he objected to. And he stuck to his guns, along with Henrietta Szold, to have a binational state. So in 1937, the Brits said, this is not going to work. We're going to have to do partition, binational state, working side by side, not going to work. We need a two-state solution. And he tried to keep alive by working with moderate Arabs towards a binational state and oppose partition. And so he said, look, if we can make this work and the Arabs cooperate with us in a binational state, we'll be able to accept many more immigrants than if anybody's persecuted, either Arabs or Jews. And if we don't get some agreement, even the Jews that are here now are going to be in danger of violence. And he saw partition as being a new Balkans, the cause of World War I. With the persecution of European Jews and the increased wave of European Jews coming, and certainly the outbreak of World War II, and increased violence within Palestine itself, the Zionist mainstream said, look, we got to have a state. We got to have at least a Jewish commonwealth. And he wrote a response in Foreign Affairs, which we started today talking about, the magazine. And he wanted a British-American initiative to prevent the division. And so at that point, that's when he started this binationalist party, where he worked with Henrietta Szold. The name of the party was Unity, or Ihud. And he continued. Here were his ideas that in a binational state, they could have an American-styled Palestinian Congress. One house would be organized by party, and the other reserved for an equal number of Jews and Arabs. And there was this British gadfly who had gone rogue and was no longer working for the British, was working closely with the Saudis, named Philby. They explored having an autonomous Jewish canton within an independent Arab state. And for that, Saudis would offer protection for the Palestinian Jews. So quite a fanciful idea, this guy Philby. His son, by the way, entered the Foreign Service and turned out to be a secret Soviet agent. Okay, so he's very much involved. You can't read this very well because of the way I did it, but he is testifying before an American committee of inquiry about the proposed partition, and he's with Martin Buber sitting at his side, and he said, "Listen, if a Jewish state's to be declared, United States, you got to impose economic sanctions because," and this is where he talked to George Marshall, as I mentioned earlier. If we don't provide the arms, there's not, or ammunition, there won't be a war. It's up to us. And he said that we have to stop the Jewish war machine. That's how strong he was. And he, as the last ditch proposal, trying to keep binationalism alive, he proposed a U.S. trusteeship instead of an independent Jewish state, because he saw it was going to lead to war. So However, as so often, terrorists have the last word. And I'm not going to be able to get to that in any detail today. But I am intrigued by, well, game theory. How is it that they always seem to get their way and they can upset things? And what kind of response does a civilization have to come up with instead of amplifying terrorism? But back in that particular moment, a Hadassah medical convoy was going to an area to provide medical care, and they were escorted by the Haganah militia, which was a Jewish militia, and they were attacked by Arab irregulars with a slaughter of 78 medical professionals and other Haganah fighters. And because of the attack on medical workers, there was a Geneva Convention against that. That Geneva Convention, I think, came up around the time of our Civil War. Some kind of protection against the Red Crosses and the NGOs providing humanitarian aid. The Arabs claimed that they were after Haganah and not the medical people. And that it was impossible to distinguish. Nevertheless, that atrocity resulted in a retaliation atrocity. Here you just have atrocities going back and forth, a tit for a tat. As Gandhi said, if it's always an eye for an eye, the whole world will be blind. And that's kind of what they're up against. And it also, these atrocities strengthened the Arab government's determination to intervene, and thus began the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, which at the start, Magnes predicted, even if we win, we're going to experience never-ending series of wars with the Arabs, which is prophetic. It's where we are today, and it was kind of a realist formulation from an idealist. So anyway, that's a good place to stop. And I think today we have a sparse crowd. I hope that I'll get some feedback on the video. So I don't know who's left, but anybody? Oh, David, you're still there.
I'm still here, John. That was great summary. I want to share with Christine. I think it was a great story about the historical background of the Arab-Israeli wars, which, as you say, are continuing to this day, and the debate of the binational versus two-state solution remains very hotly contended. Yeah.
So we can maybe go to the Magnes Library next time we're in Berkeley together.
Small world. When I was buying my house, the Magnes house on Russell was for sale. And it was not that much because it needed a low cabinet space. But it was like one at the time. I think it was 1.4 million.
Oh wow!
And it was like 6 10 rooms, but it was not. It needed another million to make it back into a house, but it's quite an estate.
Wow, well, that's cool.
How does a
Small-
rabbi get a place like that?
Small
I
what? Shigeko.
Yeah, you might have answered this question, but you were saying that Israel and America hasn't signed the Rome Accord. Which countries have signed it?
So, I'd go back to that map. Give me a second. Might take a second here.
And John, a related question is: you said that the Palestinians had, but who are you talking about? The Palestinian Liberty PLO or the PLA, or because there's a lot of debate about who actually represents the Palestinians.
I assume it was the PLO, but I don't know. I don't think anybody recognizes Hamas.
I don't think Hamas existed back then. I mean,
Yeah.
Hamas is a relatively new, kind of a side organization because of the PLO's not failure, but sort of, yeah.
Yeah. So here's the map, Sheiko. Can you see it?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So the greens are basically the states that have signed it. The yellows, or I'm sorry, orange have a unique status. They signed it once, then changed their minds. And that would be us. And look, Turkey's never signed it, maybe because of their Armenian involvement. But the West Bank and Jordan, they have signed it, and it looks like, unsurprisingly, Georgia and Armenia have signed it.
And Japan has signed it. That's amazing.
Yeah, Japan signed it, right?
John,
Yeah.
when you point, your pointer seems to go to that island, which is Cyprus, that has signed it. I'm not sure. You need to blow up, enlarge the map or zoom in to see exactly, but that looks like Cyprus to me.
You might be right. And maybe,
Of course,
and maybe,
Cyprus is now, Turkish and Greek, so
yeah,
it's a little unclear.
yeah, Greece has signed it. So,
Yeah, but Cyprus has part of it's Greek and part of it's Turkish, so
right, right. So maybe it's down here. Maybe this is the West Bank, and I don't know. Good point. I'll see what I can do. That answer your question, Shigeko?
Yes, and most of Europe has signed it then.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Most of Europe, I guess this is, well, I think this unfortunately is Ukraine.
Oh, it's Belarus. Belarus is red and Ukraine is yellow.
And yeah, but they haven't signed it.
Well, they didn't ratify it.
Yeah. Okay. And
Thank you.
yeah, and all the Baltic countries looks like they've signed it. Okay. All right.
Okay, thank you.
The big part is the Russian part.
Kaliningrad, I guess.
Yeah, that's the orange there.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank those of you who have stuck with me and we're here today. Hopefully we'll get our vacationing folks back. And any other final thoughts?
Yeah, did you ever cover how Palestine became like this? That's really weird. Split up on both ends of Israel.
I don't know. You'll show me later.
So why is the Palestinian area, Gaza and the West Bank, so far apart? Why didn't they cut it in half?
Oh, you mean the settlement after the 6-Day War? Yeah.
Seems like a dumb way to make a country.
Wasn't it partitioned between Jordan and Egypt somehow? I mean, that anyway, part of it was to be administered by different areas.
Yeah, it was. Jordan was in charge of it until the 6-Day War, and they said no thanks and backed out. And I think you're right. Egypt was in charge of Gaza, and they backed out. And so there was an Israel settlement in Gaza, and it was a big deal. They withdrew from there in 2005 and turned it over to the Palestinians. And the PLO very quickly lost control to Hamas, and the rest is history. So, all right. Any other comments, questions? All right. See y'all next week.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thanks, John.
Bye bye.